I spent the better part of my Saturday reading Nostalgia Isn't What It Used to Be by Simone Signoret. I discovered this book at the Salvation Army the other day, showed it in a hall. I had never heard of the author before, or of the fact that she was an actress. But as I started to read this, I realized where I'd heard her name before, the name of Simone Signoret. She is mentioned at least once, perhaps more than once, in Simone de Beauvoir's memoirs. She was an actress, but in addition to that, she was a political activist. She was one of the French intellectuals who signed the Manifesto 121 in relation to the Algerian War. Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir also signed that, and as well in, I believe, Force of Circumstance. Simone de Beauvoir mentions that she had heard about Simone Signoret's trip to Russia with her husband, a famous French singer, Yves Monde, I believe his name was, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Simone de Beauvoir mentioned how she had heard about their trip and an incident that happened while they were in Russia. They were Simone Signoret and her husband were kind of invited for a bite to eat with a writers' society. They were brought there under false pretenses, put on a stage, and her husband was asked to sing. Understandably upset because they had said they weren't going there for her husband to entertain these writers. They would come if it was only a bite to eat. They were upset and they walked out, and Simone de Beauvoir in her memoirs recalls this and recalls how she heard about this and is concerned that she and Sartre might end up in the same position. Anyway, this is not a discussion about Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre. This is a discussion about Simone Signoret and her husband. We start off with her early life and with her entry into the film world, into her career as an actress. She started in the film industry during the Second World War in France. She had a difficult time of it though. She was working as an extra, but she didn't have the correct papers. You had to have a permit under the German occupation to work in the film industry. She didn't have that permit, and she was afraid to even apply for that permit because her father was Jewish. He wasn't in the picture. He was in England, had left the family sort of to fend for themselves a few years earlier because of his career. She has us understand that there was a tension, a strain between her mother and her father. Her mother actually had her younger brothers baptized as Protestant to protect them as the war started, but Simone herself hadn't been baptized as Protestant, and even though she had been baptized perhaps earlier, she recalls, that baptismal certificate had disappeared. It wasn't kept. It hadn't been deemed as important in earlier years, and so she didn't have that paperwork to prove that she was a Protestant to allow her to get this work permit. So she lies, saying that she's forgotten her permit at home, and they just kind of let it pass, getting the sense that she probably doesn't have one and probably can't get one, but they allow her to work anyway. She's proficient in a number of languages. She knows a bit of German. So after the Second World War, she ends up filming a couple of films in East Germany, working in that film field. She continues to work small roles in the French film industry. And then in the 50s, she films something in England. And at this point, the English film industry was kind of at a low. Not a lot of great stuff was coming out of there, in part due to the war, I suppose. But she has a major role in a film called Room at the Top, and she wins an Oscar for that and breaks into the American market. She spends some time working and living in the United States. Her husband, who is a singer, is also doing some work in the States. Well, in the States, she meets a whole bunch of famous actors and actresses. She becomes a personal friend of Marilyn Monroe, describes living basically next door to her. But she also shares in this memoir, in this autobiography, a trip that she takes to the East in the 50s before she breaks into the American film industry. Actually, she and her husband had difficulty getting into the United States because people associated her with the communists. A lot of people thought that she was a card-carrying communist in France, even though she wasn't. Knowing the effects that it could have on her career, or on the future of her career, she and her husband still made the decision to go to Russia, where he was going to sing at a number of venues. And he was obviously a pretty big deal. I've actually looked up some of his music on YouTube. And it's not bad. I mean, it's all in French, so I don't understand most of it, but it's got a good sound. But this trip was really about him, and she just happened to be the singer's wife, who was also an actress. Her films that she had done in France to this point weren't known in Russia. But, so she and her husband go to Russia. Well, in Moscow, they meet Khrushchev. They end up having a dinner with him after one of her husband's shows, and the way she tells it, they ate and drank together until 4 in the morning when they finally parted. And during this same trip, they were there for a New Year's Eve party. Midnight rolls around, the lights go out in this room. She kisses her husband as the new year comes in and feels a hand on her shoulder, turns around and gets a full-on kiss on the mouth from Khrushchev. And she doesn't talk about her reaction to that, how that made her feel. She just kind of recounts it as this happened and then moves on from there. So you have to wonder how she felt about that, how her husband felt about that. That's kind of an odd thing to happen. And then she says, perhaps as a result of that kiss, when they're ready to leave Moscow and go to Warsaw, they're departing from the airport, and there's a plane there for them. It's a rather fancy plane. She describes it kind of as like a lounge, more of a floating luxurious lounge, flying through the air as opposed to an airplane. And it's only when they get to Warsaw and notice the strange looks of the people waiting to meet them that they realize that this is Khrushchev's personal plane that he has lent them. So that's an interesting series of events to think about. It's questionable what they did going there, because there had been something that had happened in Budapest, I believe, a few months before they went, that caused a lot of people to view Russia in an even less favorable light. And even the French embassy in Moscow didn't talk to them for the first little while they were there, because France had decided not to acknowledge the fact that they were visiting there. But then later in their trip, suddenly the embassy was interested, because they realized that Simone and her husband had been talking with Khrushchev, had gotten to know him, and the French government wanted to know what was going on. And because of that trip, because of their interaction with the communists, they found it difficult to get into America and therefore couldn't work in Hollywood until the late 50s, early 60s, when they finally did get to the United States. They described there was a weird code on their visas, on their passports, and the custom officials seemed to resent them when they arrived in the States for the first time. Because of that notation, it was a waiver basically saying, as she describes it, under our rules, under our laws, you're not allowed to come, but because of who you are, we've made an exception. We're foregoing our right to deny you access, to deny you entry to our country. It's a very interesting memoir, not as stylistically pleasing as other memoirs and other biographies that I've read, but it's interesting to get her perspective of political events happening in France and happening around the world in this time period, because I've gotten different perspectives on the same events from other biographies and other memoirs that I've read, and now I've got her perspective here as well. I've basically discovered an actress who I had no idea existed. She won an Oscar for her role in Room at the Top in 1960, I believe it was, and I was in awe because I looked up a clip on YouTube of her winning that Oscar and going up to accept it, and she was up against Doris Day in Pillow Talk. I love Doris Day. Pillow Talk is a pretty great movie. She was up against Audrey Hepburn. Love her as well. Katharine Hepburn, who I also love. And I believe the other one was Elizabeth Taylor, who great actress as well. So she was up against 4 legendary actresses whose names I recognize, whose films I've seen, and yet somehow I'd failed to hear about her. Perhaps it's because a lot of her early films were in French, in languages that I wouldn't necessarily understand, films I wouldn't necessarily see. But I'm definitely going to be checking out Room at the Top, and then the films that she worked on while she was in the States. There's certain jokes that you only pick up on if you're familiar with Proust's writing. At one point she's quite overt about it though. She says, "I hope I have been Proustian and pretentious enough." There's another point where she references having a Madeleine, that French tea cake, Madeleine memory when she touches down in Hollywood. And it's while she is in the United States, visiting in New York City, that she comes across some graffiti that provides the title for the book here. Nostalgia isn't what it used to be. This phrase is written on a wall somewhere, and so she latched onto that, and that became the title for this book, and it's mentioned in the last third or quarter of the book, and she reflects on nostalgia. Yes, but overall this book was definitely worth my time, definitely worth a entire Saturday devoted to it, reading through it slowly as I sipped cup after cup of tea. And I'm looking forward to getting on YouTube, looking up clips of her films, looking up perhaps interviews with her, and then actually finding some of her films and watching them and discovering the work of an actress that is new to me. So, Nostalgia Isn't What It Used to Be by Simone Signoret. If you're familiar with her and you have a favorite movie, please let me know, and I might end up watching that one first.